Birshus Moranim Rabbanon Chaverim Yedidim Kol Hakol HaKodesh Hazeh, this virtual gathering in which we reflect on the conclusion, the recent conclusion of the Shiva of Maran HaRav Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zecher Tzadik L'Bracha. So tonight, this is not a hesped, it's not a eulogy, because to be maspid a Talmud Chacham of the level of Rav Schwartz, so one has to be at a particular darga, at a particular level, and I'm not at that level. It's not an understanding or an appreciation because Rav Schwartz was such a tremendous Adam Gadol that I couldn't possibly grasp the totality of his Torah personality. But tonight are a few reflections. Maybe you could call them halachic or Torah reflections from Rav Schwartz, Zichrono Livracha. And I can't claim to be, a close confidant of the Rav Zichrono Livracha, of Rav Schwartz. But I could say that I had the great zichus of having learned with Rav Schwartz and listened to Rav Schwartz. As some of you know, one of the greatest privileges that I had years ago after coming to Chicago was the opportunity to listen and learn and follow and be mishamish to some extent, one of the great Torah personalities of our generation. It was a great zchus for our family, going with our children, whether it was before Yom Noraim or Purim, dressed up sometimes in very ridiculous costumes, to visit with Rav Schwartz, whether it was spending time with him in the CRC. But most importantly for tonight was the opportunity that I had in the years before he left the public eye, before Shavuos in 2016. After several years of being here in Chicago, I finally mustered up the courage to do something that I had really wanted to for a long time, but never had the temerity, never had the audacity to do. And that was to ask Rav Schwartz if he would share some of his precious time with me. And when I finally approached him, he said, of course, gladly, he would love to. And I would go weekly to meet with him in his office. And for those of you who have ever been there, you know he had a desk with stacks of papers, and then on one side was a wall of Svarim bookcases. This is an office which is adjacent to the Bezdin room, and then behind him is a plaque of an honorary degree that was given to him by Yeshiva University, his alma mater. And I went there every week for an hour. And Rav Schwartz kept a legal pad, a yellow legal pad, and every week questions that would come into him, he would jot down the questions and he would save them and share them with me. And he would share with me his thought process in how he analyzed these questions and how he considered them and how he would answer them. And through that, I had the opportunity to gain a small glimpse into the inner workings of the mind of a posek, of a Rav, of a Mora Derech. And this, in addition to the opportunities that we had in the Kolol, he used to meet with us as a group every year at the beginning of the year, several times during the year. He had a young leadership group in which several young members of the CRC, myself included, had the opportunity to learn with him. This filled out my small glimpse of this great man. And that's what we're going to reflect on tonight in this limud, which is lezichro. It's in his memory, it's in his merit, but it's truly a memorial tribute to him because it can teach us about what this Adam Gadol has to say about life, about halacha, about how we're supposed to lead our Torah lives. And we could think about this presentation in three different dimensions, three different aspects that we're going to focus on. The first aspect of Rav Schwartz's Torah personality that he emphasized to us in many ways, and he he reflected on in the conversations that he shared with me, that it was mostly him talking and me taking notes. And one of the great zchusim that I have is that I have a file full of notes that I took from these weekly sessions of the shilas that he wrote down. One of the themes that he kept coming back to, that he clearly lived and loved, is the theme of Masorah, of tradition, of minhag. Every year when we would meet with him at the beginning of the year, he would tell the Chavrei HaKolel the same story. He would tell us what it was like to be a musmach in Ritz in 1949, what it was like to be a Talmud of the Lom HaRav, of Rav Moshe Shatzkus, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha. And he told us how, because you were a student of Rav Moshe Shatzkus, when you went for your oral bechina, when you went for your smicha, it was Rav Shatzkus, Rav Soloveitchik, and Rav Dr. Belkin. And he said, because he was a student of the Lom HaRav of Rav Shatzkus, the Rav did most of the grilling, whereas when it was students of the Rav Shatzkus did most of the grilling. And he would always reflect on what that was like to be in the presence of those Gaonim from Europe. He would talk about the Chag HaSmicha from those years, being in the first kolel of Ritz. Rav Schwartz told us that he was in the first meeting, in the first kolel of Ritz in 1950, and there was a small group of Talmidim who were handpicked by Dr. Belkin, Zichrono Livracha, to join this first kolel. Rav Schwartz was one of these young Talmidei Chachamim who was invited to join the first kolel, and they had an introductory meeting with Dr. Belkin, with Rav Zipperstein, who was the Rosh Kolel, and with Rav Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Dov Alevi Soloveitchik. And he says that they sat down at the table, and he told this to all of our kolel, and he said that somebody asked, what is the purpose of a kolel? What's the purpose of a kolel? And he told this to us, to our Chavrei HaKolel and our Wa'yu Torah Mitzion kolel, because he wanted us to understand what it is that we're doing, even though he pointed out that in Europe, the kolim were usually separate from the community and ours is part and parcel of the community. So Rav Schwartz told us that he was this young boy and he raised his hand. He was the first one to speak. And he said that the purpose of a kolel, he said in Yiddish, is to be mechadish chidushim, to innovate, to come up with Torah insights. And he said that when the Rav heard this, when Rav Soloveitchik heard this, he started screaming. He said that the Rav was irate. He said, "Midaf mechadish chidushim, midaf mevar zayin the rishonim." The Rav thought it was horrible what Rav Schwartz said. You're not here to innovate. Who do you think you are? Your job is to be mevar, to clarify what the rishonim said. So Rav Schwartz then said to us, the Rav said every time his job is to be mevar the rishonim, when he clarified the rishonim, he was always mechadish chidushim. But the point was that Rav Schwartz wanted us to feel like we, in our kolel, in our generation, us young boys, we, when he were sitting in his presence, that we were connected to his Rabbeim. So those Rabbeim who came from Europe and how he spoke about them, many of these Rabbeim in Wa'yu who I had never been familiar with. Because Rav Schwartz wanted us to know that we are part of a Masorah. And that's why on some of the questions that he got questions from lay people, and he got questions from Rabbanim. He got questions that he would review with me from people who were here in Chicago, and then he got questions from around the country and around the world. One of the questions came in from a Rav, and everything that I'm going to share tonight, I didn't ask him if I could share it publicly. And even though these questions were both lahalacha ulamaisa, ein meshivin asari achar moso, nothing here is going to be construed as a precedent for anybody to rule based upon. This is not halacha lamaisa. This is just for limud, and anything that I misremember, it's all on me. So this is not meant to be a practical halacha reflection or reference, but it's just to understand what I wrote down in my notes that he was sharing. He got a question from a Rav who was asked by a group of women in their synagogue, in their particular shul, whether or not it would be okay to hand the Sefer Torah to them, that they should dance with it on Simchas Torah. And Rav Schwartz said that would not be okay, it would not be proper, because that's not the minhag of the shul. And we have to maintain the minhagim. He quoted from, some of you are familiar with the Tshuvas of the Chavas Yoyer regarding women reciting Kaddish, and the Tosfos regarding the importance of maintaining the minhag. He was also asked once about whether or not a woman could serve as a sandik at a bris. And he said he would not allow that at all, not acceptable. He was asked by a shul, he said that some of the congregants wanted to make Kol Nidre more dramatic. So they had the idea that they were going to have the chazan stand at the back of the shul at the beginning of Kol Nidre and dramatically walk to the front to the bima and conclude Kol Nidre. And they asked Rav Schwartz if that would be permitted. And he said no. He said because he thinks that's Mishana the Minhag. It's a change in the Masorah. That would not be acceptable. On the other hand, for example, he was asked about a shul that was an Ashkenazi shul. Then they had a group of Sephardic Avrechim who were coming there to learn to form a kollel in the shul. And the Sephardic Avrechim, the Sephardic Talmidei Chachamim there, wanted to know if they could include Vidui and Ein Kelokeinu in the davening, which is as per their nusach. It's true, by the way, for nusach Sfard also. So Rav Schwartz said that that was permitted because he did not consider that to be a fundamental change in the nusach, and that this constituency of the shul had the right to say that. He also quoted some achronim that even in some Ashkenazim shuls, like I mentioned about nusach Sfard. When it came to minhagim and the idea of Masorah, he quoted to me once a vart from Rav Soloveitchik at a Chag HaSmicha. I don't know what year he said this Chag HaSmicha was. Rav Soloveitchik was talking about this idea of maintaining the minhag and the Masorah and the tradition. So he quoted from Shadal that in Reform temples in Germany, they removed the passage Yakum Purkan, which is, as we know, an Aramaic prayer before Mustaf. Yakum Purkan. So apparently Shadal said, and Rav Soloveitchik invoked this in a Chag HaSmicha drasha, and Rav Schwartz said it with great enthusiasm. He quoted the pasuk in the context of the Mabul, Vayimach es kol hayakum. They erased all of the Yakum. So literally it means they erased all that existed through the floodwaters of the Mabul. But what Rav Soloveitchik was saying is that Vayimach es kol hayakum, by removing Yakum Purkan, by tampering with the Masorah and the Minhag, you have destroyed everything. Vayimach es kol hayakum. The idea of Masorah. That was one theme that he came back to often. A second theme that was very apparent was Rav Schwartz's understanding of the need to deal with people, not to deal with halacha in the abstract, but the ability to fuse halachic expertise, greatness, and tremendous, immense amounts of knowledge. He would quote from many tshuvas. He was from that generation where he quoted from tshuvas and rabbanim in Europe that I and most of my colleagues had never heard of. These are very obscure European tshuvas svarim that he had encyclopedic knowledge of just at his fingertips. But he took this expertise, this incredible knowledge, and he synthesized it with a great sensitivity, a human sensitivity, which was not lost on anybody who spoke to him. It was very apparent. Rav Schwartz maintained that understanding of the human condition, of the personal circumstance. So he wasn't just answering shilas in a vacuum in the abstract. He was dealing with and understanding people. And that has a lot of different implications. It has implications in terms of how you paskin questions and what that means sometimes for potential fallout, certain things. So for example, I once asked him a personal question about a particular practice based on something that had come up in the kollel. And he said to me, the pasuk says, Ein tzadik ba'aretz asher ya'asa tov v'lo yechta. There is no righteous person in the land who will do good and not err. So he says, it doesn't say Ein tzadik asher ya'asa tov v'lo yechta. It doesn't say that it's impossible to live as a tzaddik and not make a mistake and not err. He says it's impossible to be ba'aretz, to be me'urav imabrios, to be with people, to be connected to people. Sometimes there are going to be certain compromises, certain challenges. Maybe if you lived in a rarefied environment where you didn't interact with other people, you wouldn't have this challenge. But if you want to be a tzaddik ba'aretz, yes, there are going to be consequences. There are going to be, you could argue, there are going to be concessions. There are going to be things that will say, shasatcha kidiyeved, that maybe we wouldn't want them in the ideal, but that's what it means to be ba'aretz. Rav Schwartz was a posek ba'aretz. He understood the world in which we live and all of its challenges. He got a question once, which he told me he had paskined on multiple times, and he had himself done, regarding a double ring ceremony. We know Rav Moshe has the tshuva, and it's not accepted in halacha to have chalipin, to have an exchange as a formal marriage ceremony. The husband has to give the wife a shava pruta. She has to receive that, accept that kesef kiddushin, and that transaction affects their marriage. It cannot be an exchange that the husband gives the wife a ring and the wife gives the husband a ring. So if you were to ask Rav Schwartz, should there be a double ring ceremony? He says, absolutely not. But he said, what happened? There was this case that came to him. The question was, the couple said that they are going to insist on a double ring ceremony. The wife insists that she wants to give the ring to her husband. And if not, they're going to find a conservative rabbi who would gladly officiate at their wedding. So Rav Schwartz said, what did he do? And he said he did this himself. And this is what he suggests to others on multiple occasions. He said, this is a shasat chak. It's a difficult circumstance, but that's the nature of sometimes understanding people. And shasat chak k'di evedami, you have to come up with, if it's halachically acceptable, some way to help and to address this situation. So he said what he did was, he was Mistar Kedushin, Kedas V'Chedin, exactly as you would find at any other kosher Lamahadran wedding. They had the chuppah, they had the regular Kedushin, they had the Sheva Brachos, they had the glass. He said, and then after they broke the glass, he made an announcement. He said, we are Mazel Tov, we have now concluded the religious service, the conclusion of the formal wedding. And now, as an expression of love, the wife would like to deliver to her husband a ring in honor of their marriage. And she could say, Ani Ladodi Vidodi Li, whatever exactly was going on. So Rav Schwartz said, is it ideal? No. But is it acceptable? Did he find a creative way in a Shas HaChak that would not violate the halacha? That was his goal, because he understood that to be ba'aretz, to deal with people, means not to just look at it in the abstract. He told me once about a shaila that came that disturbed him greatly. He went back and forth and thought about it for a long time. He said, Lo Aleinu Rachmana Litzlan, there was a couple, a young woman who told her parents that she is a lesbian and that she's living with another woman and that they want to get married. And the parents, who are observant religious people, were extremely upset by this. They were disturbed. And the shaila came, they asked Rav Schwartz if they could invite this daughter and her partner to their Pesach Seder. So Rav Schwartz said he went back and forth. In the end, he concluded, he said that since this young woman, her partner is not very religious, he said it was kedai for them to invite her and for them to tell her that even though they don't accept and they don't condone this lifestyle, but they can invite her so that she should feel like she's still part of their family, so that they shouldn't lose their connection completely. There were two very difficult cases, where Rav Schwartz again understood the notion of people and where people are and what it means to have a human experience. Rav Schwartz focused a lot on understanding people's psychological makeup, their emotional nature, what he called chole hanefesh, which I believe is something that he had firsthand experience with and saw in his own life. And so he once commented to me, he said he wonders, he thinks that certain Rabbanim are not sufficiently sensitive to chole hanefesh. And I have to understand, and we as Rabbanim must be acutely sensitive to chole hanefesh, the human condition, the emotional, psychological effect that it has on a person. So there were two cases that came up over the years that he shared with me that both involved abortion, which is, of course, one of the most weighty topics that you could imagine. That Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadok Kadosh Livracha, is extremely, extremely machmir. And yet there is the opinion of the Tzitz Rav Lezer Yehuda Waldenberg, who has some leniencies. So the first case was a case, Nebuch, where the mother had a history of depression. And the child was found to be, through various tests, that the child was going to have a series of significant disabilities. And Rav Schwartz, because understanding the potential effect of chole hanefesh on this mother of trying to raise this child, told them actually that they could decide if they wanted to keep this child or not keep this child. And then he even said that if they chose not to keep the child and to follow the psak of Rav Lezer Yehuda Waldenberg and to abort, he gave them a bracha that they should have children, healthy children, through artificial reproductive technologies. He didn't just give them the heter and say, you should feel like you're a b'diavad. He gave them a heter and gave them chizuk. He understood the human condition, the chole hanefesh. There was another case. The second case was a case, unfortunately, of a single woman who was in a relationship briefly with a criminal, a person who had been convicted of certain crimes, and it was a total disaster. And Rav Schwartz was so worried about the chole hanefesh, the emotional impact that it would have to carry this child of this woman who was asking if she could have an abortion. So first he went through the issue of course, if it's before 40 days, it's Maya Ba'alma. But ultimately, he was even lenient. And of course, every person, like we said before, this is not a broad dispensation or psak. It's just, I saw this Maisa with my own eyes. He told it to me that in this understanding of chole hanefesh, of understanding what this person was going through and the circumstance in which they were in, he wanted to make sure that he looked for every possible kula. And this is understanding where people are. In the area of Taras HaMishpacha, Rav Schwartz emphasized on multiple occasions the importance of finding kulas, because he says people today, with what they're exposed to and what's going on in society, maintaining the laws and the strictures and all of the dinim of Taras HaMishpacha are challenging. Maintaining that is difficult. And so he said, we have to dafka look for kulas, because even though maybe in an ideal world we would find every chumrah, or we would try to be mahadar, whatever, Rav Schwartz said that's not the reality. That's not the aretz that we're living in. And we have to understand where people are and where they're coming from. So it was the role of Masorah, left a huge imprint. It was the notion that when you deal with a shaila, you're dealing with people. You are ba'aretz, and you understand that sometimes it means the shas hatchak, sometimes there's a human or emotional factor that plays a big role. And then there's the third section of a theme, the third section of ideas that kept coming up under the same rubric. He once told a Maisa of the Netziv that apparently someone asked the Netziv, who is a masmid? Now, parenthetically, Rav Schwartz noted that the Netziv did not follow the rules or the Hagdara that he's about to give. And some of you know that the Netziv is mentioned obliquely in the famous Chaim Nachman Bialik poem about Hamasmid. But apparently, Rav Schwartz told us, he said that the Netziv said that you know who is a Masmid? Someone who learns on time, who eats on time, and who goes to sleep on time. That's who the Masmid is, the Netziv said. So I think the third aspect of Rav Schwartz in the way that he dealt with questions, in the way that he guided me and he taught us younger Rabbanim, and I'm sure many other people, was using this idea of balanced living, of being measured, of using all of the gifts in a balanced way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you. Maybe we could just boil it down to one thing. Seichel, or what he would call the fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch. He referred to this on many occasions. We know there's Orach Chaim, Yoredeh, Even Ezra, Choshen Mishpah, but then there's a fifth chelik. It's the chelik of common sense, of just understanding seichel, of understanding the reality. So, for example, this came up in many different, sometimes humorous. He once said, the Rav once said, Rav Schwartz once said, I'm not from the Bali Midos. What does it mean, Bali Midos? I'm not from the Bali Midos. The context was regarding a woman covering her hair. So Rav Schwartz, he said that a woman, she could cover her hair with a baseball cap. So I don't know if I prodded him or I asked him, I said, well, how much hair is coming out of the baseball cap? So he says, I'm not from the Bali Midos. I'm not measuring how much hair is coming out from the back of the baseball cap. You use your common sense. You put on the baseball cap, you use your common sense. I'm not from the Bali Midos. Not from the Bali Midos. He once said a word actually from the Baal Shem HaKadosh, even though he was unquestionably from strict, Lithuanian proud tradition, but he knew so much about everything. So he knew so much about Chassidus and the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. So he quoted, the pasuk says, "Bibsarcha al tisalim," which literally means from your flesh you should not turn away. If you have relatives, family, people close to you that are your basar, don't turn away from them. Bibsarcha al tisalim. But the way Rav Schwartz quoted it, in the name of the Baal Shem HaKadosh, he said, "Mibsarcha," from your flesh, from your physical needs, al tisalim. Do not reject that. That also plays a role in your avodas Hashem. Don't be an extremist. Don't be an ascetic. When we had meetings, he was always careful. He ate, of course, just super menschlich. He was always so put together. The Gemara has an expression about the Chilul Hashem, God forbid that it is, of a Talmud Chacham who goes with a stain. Rav Schwartz always was totally put together with the tie and the hat, and how he ate with such kavod, tremendous kavod abrios, how he carried himself. But mibsarcha al tisalim, he went home every day, made sure to have lunch with the Rebbetzin, and made sure to take care of his own health, and he encouraged others to take care of their health. It was part of just using his seichel. He thought about areas in Taras HaMishpacha. He said, use your seichel. So the question came up when Neely, as part of the Kolol, under our Taras HaMishpacha initiative, we started, with his help, with his imprimatur and his halachic oversight, we started a hotline for Taras HaMishpacha questions. So one of the issues that came up was that the Kala teachers who are fielding these questions and then passing them on to local Rabbanim, and the most difficult questions went to him, of course, is that the Kala teachers are not going to know the name of the inquirer, because there's a special system that's in place that when a woman sends a question to a Kala teacher, either by text or by email or by web form, or when they call on the phone, it's all anonymous. We spoke to Rav Schwartz about how we put together this anonymizer where you can send an email, it's received by the server, and then it's sent to the Kala teacher. The Kala teacher can't see who it is. So some Rabbanim said, we're not okay with this system because you don't know who the questioner is, which of course in many areas of halacha, you need to know who the questioner is. Rav Schwartz said he thinks it's better that we not know. He said that when people call him with Taras HaMishpacha questions, he prefers not to know who they are because he doesn't want them to feel uncomfortable. That was from his fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch. He once said, you can't use, he said you can't use the term in regards to Taras HaMishpacha, to the nida questions that come up. You can't say that a woman, she bleeds. He said, it's not nice. It's not the fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch. It's not nice. He said that a mikveh has to be, in his lashon, scrupulously clean and fancy. He said it has to be attractive because that's part of just seichel. If you want it to be successful, you want it to be attractive. And then similarly in this vein, he once pointed out, he says, A lot of times people want to invoke chumras. He says, if you want to take a chumrah upon yourself and it's fitting for you, gesundheit. But he said, don't make chumras on other people's cheshbon. He said it about himself when he thought about this particular psak that he was dealing with. He says, is there a place for a chumrah here? Yeah, there's a place for a chumrah here. But you don't make a chumrah on somebody else's cheshbon. So Rav Schwartz, by melding all of these three areas together, maintaining the Masorah and the fealty to halacha, to tradition, to principle, at the same time understanding where people are coming from, and then using that fifth chelik of Shulchan Aruch, his ingenious sense of intuition and seichel, he navigated so many different questions. You know, I'll just end with one more example. There was a question that came up twice about a particular cemetery problem where somebody was found to be buried in a particular area in the cemetery that was supposed to be for Jews and it wasn't, or two different cases where this issue of somebody being buried in the wrong location came up. So we know there is a din of Ein Kovrin Tzaddik Eitzel Rasha and the whole idea of Kever Yisrael, and the person in one case was not Jewish. So Rav Schwartz came up with a brilliant idea. He said, you know what you could do around this kever? You can plant a burn. You can plant a little trim of shrubbery so that it fits into the decor of the cemetery, but it constitutes a halachic mechitza so that the people who are buried nearby shouldn't disturb their location. So he was understanding and sensitive both to the halachic requirements of how to make sure that there would be kever Yisrael, but also the people circumstance, and to use his intuition. This was just one of countless examples of how he synthesized all of these qualities. But ultimately, and we'll end with this, ultimately, all of these things emanated from a Torah personality that was refined in midos tovos, in incredible character. As many of you recall, several years ago, there was a rabbi whom Rav Schwartz knew, who was found to have committed very serious indiscretions, was ultimately convicted, and had violated not just the American law, civil law, he had violated the moral code of what it means to be a decent person, not just, of course, a Rav or a Dayan. And I came to talk to Rav Schwartz about this, to look for guidance. What would he tell me? How would he tell me to respond? I felt lost. I just couldn't believe it. What does the person say? How do we make sure this doesn't happen? So Rav Schwartz said, you know what we have to take away from this, what we have to work on? We have to work on our midos. We have to work on refining our character. That's the lesson that we have to learn. That it doesn't matter how much scholarship a person has, how much expertise, how much genius or knowledge. It comes back to the person's midos, to their refined qualities. And how many times he reflected on this in the way that he dealt with questions. A lot of times he got questions about shiduchim and thinking how to cheshbon lashon hara versus lo saman al dam reyacha, or giving somebody eitza hogenis versus eitza hogenis, eitza shein hogenis. It all came back to that refined quality, that mida, those midos tovos, that sterling character that he exemplified in every situation, which is why he was respected and revered and beloved by people across the spectrum in this community and around the world, by Orthodox clergy and non-Orthodox clergy, by people who were Jewish, by people who were not Jewish, because all of the Torah that he learned and the psakim that he gave and the Masorah and the sensitivity to humanity, and the third chelik of Shulchan Aruch, that was all novea from a mayan that was zach v'naki. It was mayim chayim. It was pure water. It was a refined character, and that's what Rav Schwartz, Zecher Tzadok v'Kadosh L'Bracha, taught us by his living example. Halavai, halavai, those of us who had the privilege to interact and catch a glimpse of this Adam Gadol, that we will be able to live by his values, his ideals, the model that he set for us. Halavai, he'll be a Melech Yosher for his family, for us, his community, for all of Klal Yisrael, and we should be zoche b'meheira v'yameinu to see the embodiment of his vision of a Torah true life in our community, and ultimately fulfilled with the Bias Goel Tzedek, Tchias HaMesim, Umach Hashem Elokim Dimamei Al Kalpanim. We'll have the opportunity to reconnect with our Rebbe, Maran HaRav Gedalia